The crimson sun of Nerax 4 hung bloated and dim in the sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Daniel Reed adjusted his breathing apparatus and surveyed the wreckage through scratched goggles. Twisted metal jutted from the scorched earth like broken bones. The battle had ended days ago, but the stench of ozone and something more organic still lingered in the air. "Should be something good here," he muttered, his voice muffled by his mask. 6 months he'd been stranded on this hellhole of a planet, ever since his salvage ship had been damaged in the crossfire between human forces and the Crescian invaders. Now he lived off whatever he could scavenge, counting the days until his distress beacon might finally bring rescue. Daniel picked his way through the debris, his scanner chirping occasionally when it detected usable tech. He'd learned to be quick. The planet's predators had a keen sense for blood and death, drawn from miles away to feast on whatever remained. Most dangerous were the Screechers, 6-legged terrors with exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire. The scanner's tone changed, indicating something of value. Daniel followed the signal to a partially collapsed bunker. As he approached, his boot struck something solid. He looked down and froze. A Crescian soldier lay sprawled on the ground, blue-tinged blood pooling beneath shattered armor. But unlike the other bodies he'd passed, this one's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. "Shit," Daniel whispered, instinctively reaching for his pistol. The Crescian's eyes snapped open, violet irises focusing on him with startling clarity. Female, he realized, noting the distinctive crest markings. She hissed something in her native tongue, hand weakly reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," Daniel said, though he knew she couldn't understand him. "I'm not here to finish you off." Their species had been at war for 3 years, ever since the Crescians had appeared in human space, claiming territories that colonists had already settled. They were formidable warriors, tall, powerful, with scaled skin in various shades of blue and green. This one had teal coloring that had paled with blood loss. Common sense told Daniel to walk away. She was the enemy, and helping her would only slow him down. But something in those defiant eyes stopped him. She wasn't begging for help, wasn't showing fear despite her obvious vulnerability. A distant screech echoed across the battlefield. Daniel's head snapped up. "Screechers. Coming this way." "Damn it," he muttered. He had maybe 20 minutes before they arrived. Plenty of time to grab what he needed and get back to his shelter. The Crescian female made another sound, this one almost like a laugh. She understood the danger too, and seemed resigned to her fate. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then cursed under his breath. "I must be losing my mind." He knelt beside her, examining her injuries. A deep gash across her torso had been hastily patched with some kind of medical sealant, but it was failing. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "This is going to hurt," he warned, though his words meant nothing to her. When he touched her arm, she snarled and struck at him with surprising speed. Daniel barely dodged backward in time. "I'm trying to help you, you stubborn lizard," he snapped. The Crescian's eyes narrowed, her ridged brow furrowing as she studied him. Then, with obvious reluctance, she extended her arm. Daniel worked quickly, applying a medical patch from his pack to her worst wound. He fashioned a crude splint for her leg using debris from the battlefield. The whole time, he kept glancing over his shoulder, listening for the approaching predators. "We need to move," he said, pointing in the direction of his shelter. "Can you walk at all?" She tried to stand and immediately collapsed. Daniel sighed and bent down, offering his shoulder. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted his help, leaning against him as they began a painfully slow journey across the battlefield. The screeching grew louder. Daniel estimated they'd covered barely a quarter of the distance to safety. At this rate, they'd never make it. "We need to hide," he said, scanning their surroundings. A collapsed tank offered the best option. He half-carried, half-dragged the Crescian female toward it, her breathing becoming more labored with each step. As they squeezed into the shadowy interior of the ruined vehicle, the first screecher appeared on the horizon, its insectoid form silhouetted against the dying sun. The Crescian looked at Daniel, her expression unreadable. Then she reached up with a three-fingered hand and touched his face in what seemed like a gesture of gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," Daniel whispered. "We're still a long way from safe." Night fell over Nerax 4 like a smothering blanket. Inside the ruined tank, Daniel kept watch through a narrow gap in the twisted metal, his hand resting on his pistol. The screechers had circled their hiding place for hours, their chittering communication echoing in the darkness. The Crescian female beside him had fallen into a fitful sleep, her breathing steadier but still labored. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Daniel allowed himself a moment of relief. They had survived the night. "Hey," he whispered, gently nudging the alien. "We need to move while they're less active." The Crescian's eyes fluttered open, those striking violet irises focusing on him with immediate alertness. She tried to sit up and winced, her hand going to the wound on her torso. Daniel offered her his canteen. "Water," he said, miming drinking. After a suspicious pause, she accepted, taking careful sips. "Daniel," he said, pointing to himself. "My name is Daniel." She studied him for a moment, then pressed a three-fingered hand to her chest. "Vaxa," she replied, her voice low and melodic despite the harsh consonants of her language. "Vaxa," he repeated, surprised at how easily the name rolled off his tongue. "We need to go." He pointed in the direction of his shelter. "Safe place." Whether she understood his words or just his gestures, Vaxa nodded. With Daniel's help, she rose to her feet, suppressing a hiss of pain. The splint on her leg held, but it was clear every movement caused her agony. They emerged from the tank into the pale dawn. The battlefield looked different in the morning light, less apocalyptic, more just sad and abandoned. Daniel supported Vaxa as they picked their way through the debris, constantly scanning for threats. "My shelter is about 5 kilometers that way," Daniel explained, though he knew she couldn't understand him. Talking helped calm his nerves. "It's not much, just an old mining facility I converted, but it's defendable. We can." A warning hiss from Vaxa cut him off. She tensed against him, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Daniel followed her gaze and saw them, a patrol of Crescian soldiers moving methodically across the battlefield, weapons drawn. "Your people?" Daniel whispered. Vaxa's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Fear. She tugged him urgently away from the approaching patrol, her expression desperate. "Not friends, got it," Daniel muttered. They ducked behind a collapsed wall, changing course to circle around the patrol. "Why are your own people hunting you?" Though she couldn't answer, Vaxa's grip on his arm tightened, her claws digging slightly into his skin through his jacket. Whatever she'd done to be abandoned on the battlefield, her former comrades weren't looking to rescue her. Their new route took them dangerously close to a ridge known to be a screecher nesting ground. Daniel considered their options: face the alien patrol or risk the indigenous predators. Neither choice seemed good. "This way," he decided, pulling Vaxa toward a narrow ravine. "We can follow this downstream, might throw off anyone tracking us." The descent into the ravine was treacherous. Twice Vaxa stumbled, reopening her wound. By the time they reached the bottom, the blue-tinged blood had soaked through Daniel's makeshift bandage. "We need to stop and deal with this," Daniel said, helping her sit on a flat rock. He rummaged in his pack for more medical supplies. As he worked to clean and re-bandage her wound, he was aware of her watching him intently, as if trying to understand why he was helping her. Their eyes met, and Daniel felt something unexpected, a connection that transcended their biological differences and the conflict between their species. The moment was shattered by a distant but distinct sound, the high-pitched whine of Crescian scan drones. They're tracking us, Daniel realized. But how? He examined Vaxa more carefully and spotted it, a small blinking device embedded in her armor at the shoulder. Tracker. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Without hesitation, Vaxa reached for Daniel's knife. He handed it to her, and she dug the tracker from her armor with a grimace of pain, then crushed it beneath her boot. Smart, Daniel nodded approvingly. But they'll have our general location. We need to move. They continued along the ravine, which gradually widened into a canyon. The red sun beat down mercilessly as morning turned to afternoon. Vaxa was weakening, the combination of her injuries and the harsh conditions taking their toll. Just a little farther, Daniel encouraged, though his own strength was flagging. A shadow passed overhead, too large to be a drone. Daniel looked up to see a Crescian scout ship, its engines humming as it swept the area. He pulled Vaxa into the shelter of an overhang just as the ship's searchlight passed over their position. They're really determined to find you, Daniel whispered. What did you do, steal their favorite toy? Vaxa, despite her pain, made a sound that might have been a laugh. She traced a symbol in the dust at their feet, a crude representation of what looked like a DNA helix crossed with a weapon. Biological weapon? Daniel guessed. Is that what this is about? She nodded grimly, then made a slashing motion across the symbol, her meaning clear. She had refused something connected to such a weapon. They left you to die because you wouldn't use a bioweapon, Daniel said, the pieces falling into place. Against us. Against humans. Vaxa held his gaze, and in that moment, Daniel understood why he hadn't been able to leave her behind. Despite being different species, they shared something fundamental, a line they wouldn't cross, even when ordered to. As the scout ship passed out of sight, Daniel helped Vaxa to her feet. My shelter is just beyond that ridge. If we can make it there, we'll have supplies, weapons, and a communication system. Maybe even a chance. The look Vaxa gave him contained something new, not just determination to survive, but something that, on a human face, Daniel would have called hope. Together, they continued their desperate flight across the hostile landscape of Nerax 4, enemies united by circumstance and something neither of them could yet name. The mining shelter loomed before them as dusk settled over the rugged landscape, a squat, utilitarian structure partially embedded in the mountainside. Daniel punched a code into the weathered panel beside the heavy metal door, which slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Home sweet home, he muttered, helping Vaxa inside before sealing the entrance behind them. Emergency lights flickered to life, illuminating the cramped interior. The shelter wasn't designed for comfort, just survival. A single room contained basic living essentials, a narrow cot, storage containers, a small kitchenette, and a communications array that had seen better days. Vaxa's eyes darted around the space, assessing it with the trained precision of a soldier. Daniel eased her onto the cot, noticing how she winced despite her attempts to hide her pain. Let me check your wounds, he said, reaching for his medical kit. To his surprise, Vaxa caught his wrist. Thank you, she said haltingly, the human words clearly unfamiliar on her tongue. Daniel froze. You speak our language? Little, she replied. Learn, for mission. He nodded slowly, processing this new information as he tended to her injuries. The wound across her torso had partially reopened during their journey, but it looked cleaner than he'd expected. Her species clearly had impressive healing capabilities. Why? Vaxa asked suddenly. Why help enemy? Daniel paused, genuinely considering the question. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I'm tired of this war. Maybe I just couldn't leave someone to die. His hands worked methodically as he spoke. What about you? That symbol you drew, was that about a bioweapon? Vaxa's expression darkened. Yes. Command want, use weapon. Kill all humans on colony world. Not soldiers. Families. Children. Her clawed hand made a sweeping gesture. All dead. And you refused, Daniel surmised. I refuse, she confirmed. Commander Drax say I traitor. Take rank, leave me die in battle. Her violet eyes held his. Better die than genocide. Daniel finished applying a fresh bandage, his mind reeling from her revelation. How many colonies were targeted? 3 planets. Many thousands humans. Vaxa struggled to sit up. Must warn them. Your people. My communications array is damaged, Daniel explained, gesturing to the cobbled-together system in the corner. I can barely get a distress signal out, let alone a detailed message. Then we go. Vaxa pointed upward. Your ship. In orbit? Daniel shook his head. Crashed. About 15 kilometers east of here, in the foothills. It's still mostly intact, but needs repairs I couldn't make alone. He ran a hand through his dust-streaked hair. With your help, though? Maybe we could get it operational. Their conversation was interrupted by a warning beep from the shelter's perimeter sensors. Daniel rushed to the small monitor, cursing under his breath. Multiple contacts approaching from the south. Crescian signatures, he reported grimly. They must have tracked our general direction before you destroyed the beacon. Vaxa pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. How many weapons you have? Daniel opened a locked cabinet, revealing his meager arsenal, a pulse rifle, his sidearm, and a few improvised explosive devices he'd fashioned from mining equipment. Not enough, he admitted. No, Vaxa agreed. We cannot fight. Must hide. Daniel shook his head. This shelter is the only structure for kilometers. If they're using thermal imaging. Underground, Vaxa interrupted, pointing at what appeared to be an ordinary storage container. There. Feels different air. Hollow. Daniel stared at her in surprise, then rushed to the container and moved it aside, revealing a maintenance hatch he hadn't noticed before. The original mining shaft, he realized. Good catch. They gathered essential supplies and descended into the dark passage just as the perimeter alarm switched from warning to alert. Above them, they heard the muffled sounds of the shelter door being forced open. The mining shaft was narrow and descended at a steep angle. Daniel led the way with a small light, conscious of Vaxa's labored breathing behind him. Her injuries made the descent challenging, but she never complained. After what felt like hours, the tunnel leveled out and widened into an excavated chamber. Ancient mining equipment lay abandoned, covered in dust and mineral deposits. We should be safe here for now, Daniel whispered, setting up his portable light. They'll search the shelter, but might not find the passage. In the dim light, he could see Vaxa properly for the first time since they'd entered the shelter. Despite her injuries, there was a fierce beauty to her alien features, the elegant crest that framed her face, the subtle iridescence of her scaled skin. Why you look at me this way? She asked, her head tilting slightly in curiosity. Daniel looked away, embarrassed. Sorry. It's just. I've never really seen one of your people up close. Not alive, anyway. Same, Vaxa replied, her violet eyes studying him with equal interest. You're kind, softer than I thought. But strong inside. She placed a 3-fingered hand over her chest. Honor. Principle. Same as best of my people. The intimacy of the moment caught Daniel off guard. Here they were, representatives of warring species, hiding together in the bowels of a hostile planet, finding common ground. If we survive this, he said softly, maybe there's hope for our peoples. Vaxa moved closer, her towering frame making her seem almost predatory until she gently placed her hand against his cheek. The texture of her skin was smoother than it looked, warm and alive. Maybe, she agreed, her face mere inches from his. Or maybe just hope for us. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The sudden tension between them was undeniable, primal, unexpected, and overwhelming. When Vaxa leaned forward, he met her halfway, their lips connecting in a kiss that defied everything he'd been taught about her kind. Her mouth was warmer than he'd expected, the sensation alien yet undeniably arousing. What began as exploratory quickly intensified, her clawed hands carefully threading through his hair as his arms encircled her waist, mindful of her injuries. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Daniel searched her eyes, looking for regret or confusion, but found only the same intense connection he felt. Above them, distant sounds of the search continuing in the shelter filtered down. But in that moment, surrounded by darkness with only a small circle of light, the war and its politics seemed very far away. "They will not stop hunting," Vaxa whispered. "Not until we both dead." "Then we need to get to my ship," Daniel replied, his hand still resting on her hip. "It's our only chance to escape this planet and warn your colonies." Vaxa nodded, her expression turning resolute once more. "We rest now. Move when they think we gone." As they settled against the chamber wall, conserving the light's power, Vaxa's head came to rest naturally on Daniel's shoulder. The gesture was so human, so vulnerable, that Daniel felt something shift within him, a fierce protectiveness that transcended simple survival. Whatever came next, he knew with absolute certainty that he would die before allowing any harm to come to her. They emerged from the mining shaft under the cover of darkness. 3 days they had waited, surviving on Daniel's emergency rations and the limited water they'd brought down. The sounds of searching had ceased above them after the first day, but they'd remained hidden, recovering their strength and planning their next move. Vaxa moved with greater confidence now, her remarkable biology having partially healed her worst injuries. She still favored her injured leg, but could walk unassisted. Daniel led the way through the night, his scanner sweeping for both Crescian signatures and the native predators. "We'll head east through the ravine system," he whispered, pointing toward the distant foothills barely visible in the light of Nerax IV's 3 moons. "It's longer, but provides better cover than crossing the plains directly." "Good strategy," Vaxa agreed, her command of human language improving hourly. She carried Daniel's pulse rifle, while he kept his sidearm ready. "Your ship, what condition?" "Damaged but salvageable," Daniel replied. The main drive was intact, but the navigation system was fried during the crash. "I couldn't repair it alone." "I can fix," Vaxa said with quiet confidence. Was engineer before warrior. Daniel glanced at her with newfound respect. "Why did you switch?" Vaxa's expression darkened. "War came. All with skills needed to fight." They moved in silence for several kilometers, each lost in their own thoughts. The ravine deepened around them, its walls rising high overhead like ancient guardians. Occasionally, they heard the distant screech of predators, but none came close enough to threaten them. During a brief rest, Vaxa traced a pattern in the dirt with a claw, a complex schematic that Daniel recognized as some kind of propulsion system. "This is what your ship uses?" she asked. Daniel nodded, impressed by her technical knowledge. "Similar, yes. If we can get it operational, we have enough fuel to reach the nearest outpost in the Centauri system." "Neutral territory?" Vaxa questioned. "Yes. From there, we can send warnings to the targeted colonies and—" Daniel hesitated. "And find somewhere safe for you." The unspoken question hung between them: what place could exist for them after this? A human and a Crescian, both now traitors to their respective sides in this conflict? Vaxa seemed to read his thoughts. "There is no safe place for us," she said matter-of-factly. "Not until truth known. Not until war ends." Their conversation was cut short by a faint humming sound from above. Daniel extinguished their light immediately, pulling Vaxa deeper into the shadow of an overhanging rock. A Crescian scout ship passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping the ravine. "They're still searching systematically," Daniel whispered once the ship had passed. "They must really want you silenced." "Not just me," Vaxa replied grimly. "You know truth now." "Both targets." They continued eastward as the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, with loose rock making their progress slower and noisier than Daniel would have liked. Twice they had to double back to avoid screecher nests. By midday, the oppressive heat had forced them to seek shelter in a narrow cave. Daniel used the opportunity to check their route on his battered NAV pad. "We're making good time," he said. "Should reach the ship by nightfall tomorrow if—" A sharp hiss from Vaxa silenced him. She gestured toward the cave entrance, her body tense, head crest flaring slightly, a defensive posture Daniel had come to recognize. Outside, the sound of falling rocks echoed through the ravine. Not the random patter of natural erosion, but the deliberate disturbance of something, or someone, approaching. Daniel drew his sidearm, moving to a position where he could see out while remaining hidden. What he saw made his blood run cold. A Crescian commando unit, 6 strong, moving with military precision through the ravine below. They wore the distinctive armor of elite hunters, their weapons far more advanced than the standard issue he'd encountered in previous skirmishes. "They sent shadow claws," Vaxa whispered, genuine fear in her voice for the first time since he'd found her. "Commander Drax's personal kill squad." Daniel assessed their options, none of which seemed promising. They were cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned. Fighting would be suicide. "We need a distraction," he said, his mind racing. His gaze fell on the unstable slope opposite their position. "If we could trigger a rock slide." Vaxa followed his line of thought, her eyes narrowing. "Your explosives. Small one might work." Daniel nodded, retrieving one of his improvised devices from his pack. "I'll need to get closer to place it effectively." "Stay here." Her hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "No. Too dangerous." "We don't have another option," Daniel insisted. "I'm smaller, less visible. Better chance to get close undetected." Vaxa held his gaze for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She pulled him close, pressing her forehead against his in what he somehow knew was a gesture of profound significance to her people. "Return to me," she said simply. Daniel slipped out of the cave, using the natural contours of the ravine for cover as he made his way toward the ideal detonation point. The Shadowclaw unit had paused, their leader examining tracks on the ground, their tracks, Daniel realized with dismay. He needed to act quickly. Finding a position with decent cover, he activated the explosive device and took careful aim at the unstable slope. One shot to trigger the detonator. That's all he needed. The pulse from his sidearm struck the device squarely. The resulting explosion wasn't large, but it was enough. The weakened slope gave way, sending tons of rock cascading down toward the Crescian unit. Most of the commandos managed to dive clear, but 2 were caught in the slide. The others immediately took defensive positions, scanning for the source of the attack. Daniel ducked down, but not quickly enough. A sizzling pulse of energy struck the rock inches from his head. He'd been spotted. Return fire from the cave told him Vaxa had entered the fight. Her aim was impeccable, forcing the Shadowclaws into cover and giving Daniel precious seconds to retreat. He sprinted back toward the cave, energy pulses scorching the ground at his heels. Vaxa provided covering fire until he dived into safety beside her. "Now what?" she asked, her breathing steady despite the tension. "Now we run," Daniel replied, pointing to a narrow fissure at the back of the cave he'd discovered during his brief absence. "That leads upward. If we can reach the ridge, we might lose them in the rock formations." They squeezed through the opening, the passage barely wide enough for Vaxa's larger frame. Behind them, they could hear the shadow claws approaching the cave. The fissure twisted upward, occasionally opening into wider spaces before narrowing again. Their progress was painfully slow, with every sound they made potentially giving away their position. When they finally emerged onto the ridge, the red sun was already low in the sky. Daniel oriented himself, identifying the distant silhouette of his crashed ship against the horizon. "There," he said, pointing. "We can make it by morning if we travel through the night." Vaxa nodded, but her attention was focused behind them. "They follow," she stated grimly. "Tracking us by scent now." Daniel hadn't considered that the Crescians might have tracking abilities beyond technology. It changed their situation dramatically. "Can we mask our scent somehow?" Vaxa scanned their surroundings, then pointed to a bubbling pool of sulfurous mud nearby, one of many geothermal features that dotted this region of Nerax 4. "This will hide us," she said. "But..." She hesitated, looking at Daniel with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "First, if we die soon, I want to know you. Completely." Before Daniel could respond, she had pulled him close, her mouth finding his with urgent need. This was different from their first kiss, more desperate, more primal. Her clawed hands tore at his clothing with surprising gentleness, careful not to damage his more vulnerable skin. Daniel responded with equal passion, his hands exploring the unfamiliar terrain of her body. They sank to the ground together, the danger behind them only heightening the intensity of their connection. Their coupling was unlike anything Daniel had experienced, alien yet profoundly intimate. Vaxa's strength both intimidated and excited him, while his gentleness seemed to affect her deeply. Afterward, they lay together briefly, their breathing synchronizing in the gathering dusk. "No regrets," Vaxa whispered, tracing a claw gently along his cheek. "None," Daniel agreed, understanding the significance of what had just happened. They had crossed a final line, not just allies or friends, but something unprecedented between their species. The moment of peace was shattered by a distant signal chime. The shadow claws were communicating, growing closer. Hurriedly, they gathered their equipment and immersed themselves in the sulfur pool, the acrid mud coating their skin and clothing. The sensation was unpleasant, but Daniel knew it might make the difference between life and death. As darkness fell, they set out toward the ship, their bodies still humming from their encounter, the hunters still trailing behind, always present, never quite catching up. The final leg of their journey had begun. The crashed ship sat half buried in the foothills, its sleek form now scarred and twisted by its violent descent. Daniel and Vaxa approached cautiously, the first light of dawn illuminating the wreckage. The sulfur mud had dried on their skin, cracking with every movement, but it had served its purpose, they'd managed to stay ahead of their pursuers through the night. "There she is," Daniel said, a mix of relief and apprehension in his voice. "The horizon. Not much to look at now, but she was a good ship." Vaxa surveyed the crash site with a critical engineer's eye. Structure mostly intact. "Good landing, considering." "Wasn't exactly a landing," Daniel replied with a grim smile. "More of a controlled crash after your people's fighters damaged my propulsion system." They crossed the final stretch of open ground quickly, aware of their vulnerability. The ship's main hatch was partially buried, forcing them to use the emergency access panel on the upper hull. Daniel climbed up first, then helped Vaxa, noting how she winced despite her attempts to hide her pain. Her injuries had improved, but were far from healed. Inside, the ship was dark and silent, emergency power having long since drained. Daniel manually engaged the backup systems, bringing minimal lighting online. "Main engines are intact," he explained, leading Vaxa through the cramped interior to the engineering section. "But the navigation computer was fried, and I couldn't bypass it alone." Vaxa ran her clawed hands over the control panels, her expression focused. "Show me diagnostics." Daniel activated a portable power cell, bringing the diagnostic systems to life. Screens flickered with damage reports and system status indicators, most showing critical failures. Navigation, communication, life support, all damaged, Vaxa observed. But engine core functional. With bypasses, could make one jump. One jump is all we need, Daniel said. Just to reach the Centauri outpost. They worked together with surprising efficiency, Vaxa's engineering expertise complementing Daniel's knowledge of the ship's systems. Hours passed as they rerouted power, bypassed damaged components, and jury-rigged essential systems. "Hand me the flux coupler," Vaxa requested, her upper body disappearing into an access panel. Daniel passed her the tool, their fingers touching briefly. Even in their desperate situation, the contact sent a charge through him, a reminder of their connection. By midday, they had made significant progress. Life support was partially restored, the engines were primed, and the navigation system had been bypassed with a manual input override. "We need about 4 more hours," Daniel estimated, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then we might actually have a chance." Vaxa emerged from beneath the control panel, a streak of grease across her scaled face somehow making her look more beautiful to Daniel's eyes. "Ship will fly," she stated with confidence. "Will carry us to safety." A warning beep from Daniel's scanner shattered the moment of hope. Multiple signatures approaching from the west, fast. "They found us," he said grimly, checking the readout. "Shadow claws, and something bigger. A transport vehicle." Vaxa's crest flattened against her head, a sign of alarm Daniel had come to recognize. "Commander Drax," she said softly. "He comes himself." Daniel grabbed his weapons, checking the charge. "We need to hold them off while the final systems come online. The ship's defensive shields aren't operational yet." "I know this, Commander," Vaxa warned. "Ruthless. We'll sacrifice all to complete mission." They took positions at the ship's access points, sealing what they could and preparing to defend the rest. Daniel distributed his remaining explosives around the ship's perimeter, creating a crude but effective defense line. The Crescian forces arrived with military precision, surrounding the crash site in a standard encirclement pattern. The Shadowclaws took advanced positions while a heavily armored figure emerged from the transport, Commander Drax himself, his ornate armor marking his elite status. "Specialist Vaxa," a voice boomed in heavily accented human language. "You dishonor yourself by hiding with this human. Face judgment with dignity." Vaxa tensed beside Daniel. "He tries to provoke me," she whispered. "Crescian honor demands I answer challenge." "It's a trap," Daniel replied. "He just wants you in the open." "I know," she said, her violet eyes fixing on his. "I will not leave your side." Commander Drax's voice came again. "You were once among my most valued warriors, Vaxa. Your skills, your intelligence, wasted now. For what? This human? Our ancestors would weep to see such degradation." Daniel could see the words affecting Vaxa, touching on cultural values he couldn't fully understand. "Don't listen to him," he urged. "He's trying to get into your head." "The bioweapon is already deployed," Drax continued, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "The human colonies will fall within days. Your defiance was meaningless." Vaxa and Daniel exchanged alarmed looks. If Drax was telling the truth, millions of lives were at stake. "We need to get this ship operational now," Daniel said urgently. "The outpost has to be warned." A barrage of energy weapons suddenly bombarded their position as the Shadowclaws began their advance. Daniel triggered his perimeter explosives, sending several attackers flying, but more quickly took their place. "Return to the ship," Daniel ordered. "Finish the preparations. I'll hold them off." "No," Vaxa refused, her weapon firing with deadly accuracy. "Together we fight. Together we leave." The battle intensified, energy pulses scorching the hull around them. Daniel took a glancing hit to his shoulder, the pain searing through him. Vaxa killed 2 Shadowclaws with precise shots before a blast knocked her backward. Inside, Daniel shouted, providing covering fire as they retreated into the ship, sealing the hatch behind them. How long until launch? Vaxa asked, applying a medical patch to Daniel's wounded shoulder. 20 minutes for full power, he replied, wincing. But we're out of time. A massive explosion rocked the ship. The Crescians had breached the outer hull. They could hear the commandos entering the lower level. The engine core, Vaxa said suddenly. If overloaded, creates pulse. Could disable their weapons, vehicles. And kill us in the process, Daniel pointed out. Not if contained, directed outward. Her eyes held his. I can modify. But need time. Daniel understood immediately. You work on the core. I'll hold them off. They shared one final, desperate kiss before separating, Vaxa to the engine room, Daniel to the ship's narrow access way where he could bottleneck the advancing forces. The first Shadowclaw appeared at the end of the corridor, weapon raised. Daniel fired first, the pulse catching the commando in the chest. Another immediately took his place, forcing Daniel to duck behind a support beam as energy blasts filled the air. The firefight continued, Daniel gradually giving ground but making the Crescians pay for every meter. A blast caught his leg, sending him sprawling. As he struggled to rise, he found himself staring up at Commander Drax himself, the imposing Crescian's weapon aimed at his head. Where is the traitor? Drax demanded. Daniel laughed despite the pain. Go to hell. Drax raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the ship lurched violently. Emergency lights flashed as a surge of power ran through the systems. Daniel. Vaxa's voice came through the intercom. Engine core ready. Get to bridge. With a final surge of adrenaline, Daniel rolled away from Drax's shot and staggered toward the bridge, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He sealed doors as he went, buying precious seconds. Vaxa was waiting on the bridge, her hands flying over the controls. Core modification complete. Ship power at maximum. Launch sequence initiated. Drax's forces were pounding on the sealed bridge door, the metal beginning to glow from their cutting tools. Will it work? Daniel asked, collapsing into the pilot's seat. Yes, Vaxa replied with certainty. But someone must remain to direct pulse. Cannot be automated. Daniel's eyes met hers, understanding dawning. No. There has to be another way. No time, she said softly. Your piloting skills needed to reach outpost. My engineering skills needed here. She touched his face gently. One must stay. One must go. Logical choice. The door began to give way, the edge melting under the intense heat of the Crescian cutters. I won't leave you, Daniel insisted, his voice breaking. You must, Vaxa replied. Millions will die otherwise. She pressed something into his hand, a data crystal. Proof of bioweapon. Targets. Everything needed to save your people. The launch sequence reached its final countdown. Vaxa pulled Daniel close one last time, their foreheads touching in the Crescian gesture of deepest connection. Remember me, she whispered. Before Daniel could stop her, Vaxa pushed him into the escape pod adjacent to the bridge and sealed the door. Through the viewport, he saw her smile once before engaging the launch sequence. The pod ejected with violent force, shooting away from the ship just as the bridge door gave way. Daniel screamed Vaxa's name, helpless as he watched the Shadowclaws pour onto the bridge. Moments later, a massive pulse of energy erupted from the ship's core, expanding outward in a perfect hemisphere. The Crescian forces, their vehicles, even Commander Drax himself, all were engulfed in the pulse, their systems instantly fried. But the ship itself collapsed inward, the core implosion destroying everything inside. Daniel's pod continued its automated ascent, breaking atmosphere and setting course for the Centauri outpost. Through his tears, he clutched the data crystal, Vaxa's final gift to his people. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood at the window of the Centauri Diplomatic Center, watching representatives from both human and Crescian governments arriving for peace talks. The bioweapon plot had been exposed, its architects on both sides arrested. The data crystal had contained more than evidence, it had held the key to understanding between their species. A Crescian delegation approached him, led by an older female whose crest markings reminded him painfully of Vaxa. "Daniel Reed," she said in careful human language. "I am Elder Severath. Vaxa was my daughter." Daniel straightened, meeting her violet eyes so similar to her daughter's. "She saved millions of lives. Human and Crescian." "Yes," the elder agreed. "Her sacrifice has become legend among our people. A symbol of what we can become." She handed Daniel a small object, a scale-like pendant that shimmered with iridescent colors. "This is the crest of ascendance," she explained. "Our highest honor. The council awards it to Vaxa's memory and to you." Daniel accepted the pendant, its weight somehow comforting in his hand. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Elder Severath looked toward the diplomatic chamber where the future of their peoples would be decided. "Now we build something worthy of her sacrifice. Something that might have made her proud." As Daniel followed the Crescian delegation into the chamber, he touched the pendant against his heart. In the darkest times on a hostile world, he and Vaxa had found something beautiful, a connection that transcended species, politics, and war. Now that connection would become the foundation for peace. "Remember me," she had said. And he always would.